Hello and welcome to Daanish TV. Today's very special show on Daanish TV for our Pakistani audience, especially and generally for the global audience. And the guest is renowned intellectual, public intellectual, world's number one intellectual, Professor Noam Chomsky, the one and only. Welcome to the show, sir.
Glad to be with you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your time. And here I would request Mr. Dr. Junaid Ahmed from Washington, D.C. to help us to conduct this interview, this talk, this conversation. Dr. Junaid Ahmed from Daanish TV. Right now he's in Washington. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Advai. Assalamu alaikum.
I would request you to introduce, if necessary, if needed, to the show, to the topics, and to the guest. And please carry on.
Wonderful. Well, considering the prior conversation I had with Professor Chomsky and, of course, his very busy schedule, I would suggest everyone just to go on and click Noam Chomsky on Google to find out the bio of our the most, as Shahid Bhai said, if the most prominent intellectual, I think, alive today. I think that Professor Chomsky sometimes has a quibble with that much earlier quote of the New York Times. But just to, so I won't go into the details of Professor Noam Chomsky's detailed biography, but just on a personal note to say, for all of our viewers in Pakistan and throughout the world, that in my humble opinion, that we are speaking with a man who has literally inspired roughly 5 to 6 generations of activists. And I know that he won't like when I say single-handedly, but I know from my father's generation coming from Pakistan and to my generation, to my daughter's generation, he is someone that literally has done the work in his writings and activism that has inspired all of us. And so since we have limited amount of time, I'm not going to go into the extraordinary biography of Professor Noam Chomsky. So if Professor Noam Chomsky does not mind, if we can go straight into a couple of pertinent questions we have coming here from Pakistan.
Okay.
Wonderful. Professor Chomsky, there's a significance to the date that we are having this interview on. And that is September the 11th, 2020. Now, on September the 11th, 2001, we all know of the horrible atrocities, the terrorist attacks that took place in the United States. And it's, quite, I think, important to kind of assess what has gone on. But before that, there was often a mantra heard, and I'm going to ask you because I know that throughout this year there's been a lot of very necessary discussion with you about the current crisis in the United States, in the world, and of course President Trump. Hopefully we'll get time to get to that as well. But I do encourage viewers to also see a plethora of interviews with you and talks that go into very deep analysis of the crisis right now. So I will ask you to kind of go rewind a little bit for our viewers here, particularly you knowing that Pakistan and this area of the world has been at the front lines of the so-called war on terror. So the first thing that I'll ask you is that the war on terror that was declared and September the 11th, in fact, even prior to that, we heard a lot from the media, from the political, from the intellectual culture about how this event changed the world dramatically and completely changed the world. Now, I know that you also considered conceded to that point somewhat, but had a slightly different perspective on how that event changed the world. Could you speak about that a little bit?
Well, first of all, we should bear in mind that what happened on September 11th, 2001 is the second 9/11. The first one was far more serious, but the first one was perpetrated by the United States against another country, where the United States overthrew a parliamentary regime and installed a vicious dictatorship. That was Chile. In terms of effect, it was far greater than what we call 9/11. So if you put it in per capita terms, which are the right terms, it's as if in September 11th, 2001, 30,000 people had been killed, 500,000 had been tortured, the government was overthrown, and a vicious dictator had been installed, carrying out torture, murder, and so on. That didn't happen on what we call 9/11, but it did happen on the first 9/11. Now, the fact that we know one and not a much worse one is a reflection of U.S. power. When something happens to the United States, it's a tragedy. It's incomparable. The world changes. When the United States does it to some other country, let's forget about it. It doesn't matter, even though it was much worse. So it's worth keeping that in mind. We are now talking about the second and lesser, much lesser 9/11. Why did that change the world? Because the U.S. runs the world overwhelmingly. So therefore, if something happens to the United States, changes the world. It's as if we were thinking, let's say, of the mafia. If you murder, if the mafia don murders a small shopkeeper because he didn't pay his protection money, maybe you get a small notice in the newspaper. If somebody kills the godfather, the whole world changes. Well, keep that in the back of our minds. So what happened 9/11, 2001? The United States was struck for the first time since 1812. The United States has been in a situation of astonishing security. The United States has been at war just about every day since its founding, but these were wars of aggression, so therefore they're not called wars. We now talk about, you've heard the phrase endless war, a lot of laments about how the United States is involved in endless wars in Afghanistan and Somalia and so on. We have to stop these endless wars. The endless wars started in 1783. To the credit of former President Carter, he's one of the few people who's pointed out that the United States has been constantly at war throughout its history. One of the main reasons for the American Revolution was that the British had imposed a limit on expansion of the colonies. King George V announced that he produced a royal proclamation, said the colonists can't go beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the mountains that bound the eastern United States. Beyond that was Indian territory. The Indian nations were, that was their country. The colonists didn't want that. They wanted to expand. One of the main reasons for the revolution. As soon as the British were out, started expanding, went to war against the Indian nations. That went on right through the 19th century, a war of extermination, a violation of treaties, essentially massacre of the indigenous population. It was punctuated by another war, which the United States invaded Mexico, took over half of Mexico, like where I'm living right now in Arizona, California, all Mexican territory, conquered in a war of aggression. And by the late 19th century, the United States was beginning to intervene in other countries in the region, Central America and so on. I won't go through the rest of the record, you know it very well. So what happened on 2001, September 11th, is that the Mafia Don was injured. and you can't have that. So yes, there was a significant change. The United States redeclared the war on terror.
And that's what, Professor Chomsky, that's what I wanted to follow up with you on, that in fact, we have heard you say that in fact this was the second time the United States had declared this war on terrorism, the first time being during the 1980s under the Reagan administration. And one of the things that I wanted to really highlight this for is because there has been, you probably are familiar with it as well, a widespread perception since the beginning of this war on terror under George W. Bush, that this has been a war on Islam because of predominantly Muslim countries being invaded or being the victims of various occupations and invasions, that this has been a war on Islam. Now, and I think that this is where you mentioned that actually this is first of all, the second time actually that it's a war on terrorism that's been declared, as well as an interesting point that you make that I think that our listeners would be really keen on hearing what you mean by it, that effectively the US government was at war with a certain strand of the Catholic Church in the 1980s. So if you could kind of elaborate on that.
As I said, the U.S. has been at war with just about everybody. As far as the war against the Muslim world is concerned, that's been going on for 1,000 years. One of the great historians, William Polk, died recently, personal friend, great Arabist, a great historian, he was a member of the National Security Council in the United States, a high-level actor in international affairs, but a great historian. Has a book called The Crusaders and Jihadis. It's about the 1,000-year war, as he calls it, of the North, includes Russia, against the global South, which was mostly Muslim. So it's essentially what he describes as a 1,000-year war against the mostly Muslim South. Russia, of course, expanded from the small Duchy of Muscovy all over Islamic territories. Britain, France had conquered much of the Islamic world. The United States came into the act later, a little bit before the Second World War, but mostly afterwards. So yes, there's been a global war for a mere 1,000 years. We're now in a new phase of it. The war against the Catholic Church began in 1962 when Pope John XXIII called a international Vatican meeting called Vatican II, the Second Great Vatican Council. He urged the church to return to the Gospels, which they had basically abandoned in the 4th century when the Roman Emperor Constantine took over the church as the official church of the Roman Empire. Great historian of Christianity, Hans Küng, describes this as a shift from the church of the persecuted to the church of the persecutors. And as he points out, Vatican II in 1962 tried to reverse that long time. Pope John urged a return to the message of the Gospels. The Gospels are basically radical pacifist. Preferential option for the poor should be the guiding theme, very different from what the church had been. This was picked up by, especially in Latin America, a few other places, by the bishops, priests, nuns, lay people, persons went into the villages, tried to bring villagers the message of the Gospels, its radical pacifist message, tried to help them organize to take their lives into their own hands. They lived in extremely repressive, brutal societies backed by the United States, sometimes installed by the United States. And as soon as the United States heard about this, essentially went to war against the church. That's why you have a long series of religious martyrs right through the next several decades. And some of them became famous, like Archbishop Romero was murdered while he was reading Mass. This horror story ended in 1989 when 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, were murdered in the Jesuit university by an elite unit, armed, trained, directed by the United States. Actually, just today, in a Spanish court, one of the top Salvadoran officers involved in the murder was indeed charged with the murder. Okay. Now, it's not a secret that the United States went to war with the church. You can find it out from official U.S. documents. So
right.
The School of the Americas has been since renamed because it got a bad reputation. But the School of the Americas, which trains Latin American officers, mainly killers and murderers and torturers, it has what it calls talking points. It's advertised how wonderful it is. And one of the talking points is the U.S. Army helped defeat liberation theology. Liberation theology is the movement that developed from Vatican II. So it's true, the U.S. Army and the School of the Americas helped defeat it. So that's the war against the church.
Absolutely.
These events that happened but aren't part of history, like the first September 11th.
That's right.
Not part of history, but it happened.
Absolutely. Professor Chomsky, and in fact, this is why I wanted you to highlight that, because of the perception. You were very correct in what you said in terms of the historic kind of what you can call in the modern parlance Islamophobia, that type of driven crusades and other types of wars that have taken place between Christianity and the West. But of course, not just conflict, but also a lot of cooperation and so on and so forth. But I wanted you to highlight this point, particularly because of many people in the Muslim world post the September 11th, 2001 attacks, thinking that, well, this war on terrorism is war against the faith of Islam, rather than having the other kind of objectives that actually I did want you to get into very, very briefly. I mean, your assessment of the past 19 years of the war on terror, in which right next door in Afghanistan, of course, I'm in Washington, D.C., but I'm normally in Pakistan. Right next door, we still have American troops. And so just a quick assessment, not just obviously of Afghanistan, but the chaos created in the Middle East and so on and so forth. Your quick assessment of what that war on terrorism has accomplished and has failed to accomplish.
It's pretty easy. Let's go back to 2001. Islamic terror. First of all, I should point out one point. When you talk about Islamophobia, it's very misleading. The United States strongly supports the most radical, harsh Islamic states, the Gulf dictatorships. No Islamophobia there. In fact, the U.S. government has had very close relations, intimate relations, strongly supports them. They're the harshest, most reactionary Islamic states in the world, but they're the big favorites.
Very true.
The present. So the question is obedience and subordination. If parts of the Islamic world, like the Gulf dictatorships, are obedient, subordinate to the United States, they're wonderful. If they're independent, you have to destroy them. But that's true whether they're Islamic or anything else. I can give you a long list of governments been not at all Islamic, over Christian, whatever, overthrown by the U.S. So the issue is obedience. But let's turn to your question. We'll take a look at the Second War on Terror, September 2001 up till today. Where was Islamic terror found in September when the War on Terror was declared? in a small corner of right on the East Pakistan-Afghan border, little tiny area there. That's where Al-Qaeda was located. That was the terrorism in September 2001. Where is it now? All over the world. Africa, it's tearing Africa apart. Indonesia, Philippines, South Asia, Middle East, of course, all over. And it's spread everywhere. So one of the effects of the war, so-called war on terror, was to vastly increase Islamic terrorism. Instead of being confined in a tiny area of the AfPak border, it's now all over the world. Don't have to tell you what happened in the Middle East. The war, so-called war on terror, was used as a pretext to do something that the right-wing American leadership had always wanted to do, invade and conquer Iraq. Iraq's a major prize, one of the major sources of oil in the world, easily accessible. It's not like digging in the, deep in some seabed. You just stick a pipe in the ground, water comes up. So it's tremendous, and it's right in the middle of the main energy producing region in the world. It's been understood by the United States officially since the end of the Second World War that the energy resources of the Middle East are a strategic treasure of enormous significance, which the United States must control. It's kind of like almost axiom one of international affairs since 1945. So invading Iraq would have been a wonderful prize, but it's hard just to invade a country. So the war on terror, so-called, gave a kind of pretext under the pretense that there were weapons of mass destruction. We don't have to go into that. Well, what did the war and invasion of Iraq do? First of all, killed hundreds of thousands of people, created millions of refugees, tore the country to shreds. It instigated sharp ethnic conflicts which hadn't existed before. I don't want to go into this because you know it perfectly well. These conflicts then spread around the entire regions, tearing the region to shreds. One outgrowth of this was ISIS, almost conquered Iraq. It was mainly stopped by Iranian intervention, finally backed by the United States, then spread to Syria and other. In fact, the whole region is in chaos and destruction.
Absolutely.
An immense blow against the stability and the health of the entire region. And it's not just there. Take the NATO bombing of Libya. Gaddafi was not a nice guy by any means, but Libya was a stable, prosperous country functioning. After the NATO attack, it's a total wreck. It's in the hands of warring militias. Countries ruined. Not only that, but the Tuareg tribes to whom Gaddafi had handed over control of the huge weapon supplies, just sent them off to Africa, some to the Middle East. Now it's tearing West Africa to shreds. That's the NATO bombing of Libya. That was mainly French, with the British and the Americans behind. This is the history of 1,000 years,
Yes.
Case.
Absolutely, absolutely. Professor Chomsky, the point that one thing that comes up out of this discussion is the numerous amount of kind of recycled Orientalist cliches. Of course, your late good friend Edward Said wrote about this, about the type of mantras, the type of stereotypes about these societies that, of course, have existed throughout the colonial period, about these being backward savages that need some type of Western intervention, the white man's burden, or so on, to kind of rescue them from themselves. In Afghanistan, we saw this very clearly with the rhetoric around rescuing Muslim women from Muslim men, and so on and so forth. So this rhetoric has been there for quite a while. One of the things that has really, I think, perturbed many of us critical critical intellectuals and activists is that not only have the neo-Fergusons and others who are speaking about, that colonialism was not all that bad, and perhaps some form of neo-colonialism will be good for the natives, but also what is sad to see is that what we can call in classical terms the comprador native intelligentsia of many of these societies, and I can speak for Pakistan itself, also sometimes kind of reminisce and have nostalgia for the British Raj, and they brought us railroads, taught us English, taught us how to use forks and knives. And it always reminds me of your book I read a long time ago, Year 501, The Conquest Continues. So I don't know, any reflections from you on this very problematic narrative that we hear?
Well, it's true that imperialist power and imperialist violence has often led to things that the colonized power could pick up and do something with. So, for example, if you take, say, the Soviet Empire, hardly benign, but take a look at Bulgaria, for example. In 1940, when Stalinist Russia took over Bulgaria, peasants were using wooden plows. It was a very backward country. 20 years later, they were producing high-level electronic goods. Does that justify the Russian takeover of Eastern Europe and all the violence and destruction that took place? Well, of course not. That happens to be a byproduct of it. And if you take a look at India, let's say, which of course included what's now Pakistan, the British built railways for their own benefit to take out essentially deindustrialize India, which had been one of the centers of world economic and cultural development, devastated by British imperialism. But the British did build railways for their own benefit. Okay, now what's left of the wreckage that Britain created can use the railways, just as in Bulgaria, the victims of Stalinist violence can produce electronic goods. Yeah, that's the Japanese were brutal occupiers. Japanese imperialism in, say, Korea, what's now Taiwan, was violent and brutal. But it also laid the basis for an industrial society. They did develop the societies to some extent for their own reasons and interests, but they did it. So yes, that's the history of imperialism all the time. Nothing new, really.
Absolutely.
There's a class of people called intellectuals whose task is to justify whatever is done by state violence and state power. That's been the mainstream of intellectuals throughout history. That's been
absolutely, and in fact, Professor Chomsky, that brings me very much to some of your earliest essays on towards what you call the new military humanism. One of the essays that had an enormous impact on me and my late father was your essay, "The Responsibility of Intellectuals," and it has been clear throughout your writings and talks that it's your ire and your critique is not just of the right wing or the white supremacists today, whatever you want to call them, but of liberal intellectuals that have been complicit in the goals of the American empire, in particularly in the modern era, from Clinton to Obama, of the neoliberal era, who have been complicit in the deepening the social inequalities within the United States and globally. And so that's something that I also wanted you to speak about, because here we also have a similar problem in which I think the issues that you raise about in the United States, how the political system uses issues of distraction, of say religion, of culture, this type of thing, to distract from and deflect away from the central issues of the core of the economy, of the political system, and so on. I think the similar thing happens in Pakistan as well, when you start to go on, okay, well, there's these religious issues, and then there's religious fundamentalists, and then there's nice, enlightened, secular, liberal elites, and so on and so forth. So I think that if you can kind of enlighten us of what your critique has been since, I think, the Vietnam War days, about kind of the liberal intelligentsia and their role in propping up, but as you say, state violence, state corporate violence, in fact.
Well, Pakistan has very deep problems, which you know better about than I do. I would like to talk about them, but there's no time. Let's talk about the United States and the liberal intellectuals. Let's start with the Iraq War. If in the mainstream, say, taking Obama at one extreme, right-wing Republicans at the other extreme, there are two views about the Iraq War. One is at the right wing, we should have done it better. There were bad things that were done. At the left part, so-called left, Obama, exactly the same. Obama is greatly admired because he called the Iraq War a strategic blunder. That's a criticism of the Iraq War. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, the early 1980, Russian generals said this is a strategic blunder. We shouldn't be invading Afghanistan. Do we honor them for that? When Hitler invaded Eastern Europe, there were many high-level German Nazi officials, military officials, who said, this is a strategic blunder. We should knock out England first and then turn to the East. Do we honor them? No, in fact, we condemn them. It wasn't just a strategic blunder, it was a major crime. The kind of crime for which people were hanged at Nuremberg. But the most you can say is it was a blunder. Exactly the same with Vietnam. I've reviewed this in some detail. 1975, when the Vietnam War was over, everyone had to write something about the Vietnam War, of course. So you get a spectrum of commentary. That's very interesting. Starts from the hawks, who say we were stabbed in the back. If we'd fought harder, we could have won. The peace movement stabbed us in the back, and so on and so forth. That's the hawks. Then you go to the far left, what's called the left, say Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, a very sharp, independent critic of U.S. policy, about as far as he can go and still be anywhere near the media. He wrote about it, and he said, the war began with blundering efforts to do good. Why to do good? Because the United States government did it. So therefore it was to do good. It's an axiom. Why blundering? Because it failed. Then he said, by 1969, it became clear that it was a mistake, that the United States couldn't bring democracy to Vietnam at a cost acceptable to itself. That's the left wing. Meanwhile, this happened to be another group of people, two groups in the country. One were those few intellectuals who said the war is not a mistake, it's a crime. It's the worst crime since World War II. Well, there was a name for those people. They were called the wild men in the wings. That's McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy, Johnson, National Security Advisor, Harvard Dean, left intellectual. So there are the wild men in the wings who say it wasn't just a mistake, it was a crime. There's also the population, general population, whose attitudes are very carefully monitored, extensive polls. The same year, 1975, about 70% of the population in the United States said the war is not a mistake, it was fundamentally wrong and immoral. So there's the mainstream intellectuals who say, maybe a mistake, maybe we didn't try hard enough. Then there's two other groups, the wild men in the wings, a small group of intellectuals who said it's a major crime, and the huge majority of the American people who say it's not a mistake, it's fundamentally wrong and immoral. But their views are out of it. And of course, the wild men in the wings are out of it.
That's right.
It's the mainstream intellectuals, people like Obama. Iraq war was a mistake, a strategic blunder. We honor him for that. That's common, and I'm afraid I have to leave. I have another interview in 2 minutes.
Right. Professor Chomsky, just one last question, because on our local, in our local setting on the Kashmir question and what's going on in India, I'm sure it's deeply painful for you as well, who's visited India many times to inspirational places like West Bengal and Kerala and so on. But your good friend Arundhati Roy, the late Iqbal Ahmed, they wrote about Kashmir. You must be following what's going on in Kashmir and in India as a truly, what Arundhati Roy aptly distinguishes, from Trump, as just representing Trump, not some ideology, but Moodi really coming from a fascist movement emerging from the 1920s. Just very, very brief thoughts on what's going on in India and Kashmir.
Yeah, I'll say just a word about that, but first another word. Wherever we are, our prime concern should be where we are in a position to affect what happens. That's typically our own country. So for me, the crucial issues are what's done by the United States. For you, the crucial issues are what's happening in Pakistan. We can certainly talk about India, but Pakistan is the highest priority for you. Just same, if you're in New Delhi, your highest priority is India. Okay, with that in the background, what's happening in India is disgraceful. Moodi is tearing to shreds the last remnants of Indian secular democracy, which was quite lively and effective within India, turning it into a right-wing Hindu nationalist state, highly repressive of a huge Muslim population. Kashmir is just taking it over, destroying the country. It's all of its autonomy. The country has long been under military rule, but now it's just extraordinary. It's just total repression. People locked up under massive control by the Indian military forces. This is a disaster. And regrettably, Moodi has high popular support. Polls show great support. Not only is this tearing the country apart, but even with a horrifying policies with regard to the coronavirus, which is killing huge numbers of Indians, but the popular support remains. These are some of the disasters of modern affairs, and I'm very sorry, but I really have to leave.
We really understand. Thank you so much, Professor Noam Chomsky. It's been quite an honor and privilege to have you with us here.
Yes, I'm very sorry to have to leave right now.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much, Professor Chomsky, on the behalf of Daanish and Daanish TV and Pakistani people. We are so much obliged and so much thankful to you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Check. Yeah, Junaid. So
It's
here was the Professor Chomsky.
so.
Uh,
It's still live. If you turned
yeah,
on.
we are still live. और मेरे पास हमारी ऑडियंस के बहुत से क्वेश्चंस आ रहे हैं जो हम चाह रहे थे कि उनसे करें, लेकिन उनके पास टाइम कम था, तो हम अपनी ऑडियंस से माजरत करते हैं. बहुत से इश्यूज इंक्लूडिंग पैलेस्टाइन, इंक्लूडिंग इवन कश्मीर, इंक्लूडिंग मैनी अदर्स, तो वो रह गए. इंशाल्लाह हमारी कोशिश होगी कि उनको जल्द किसी और वक्त किसी और प्रोग्राम में दोबारा लाइव लेकर आए और उनसे वो तमाम सवाल जो रह गए हैं.
वैसे तो अगर शाहिद भाई, if there are some urgent questions that you अगर आप I mean we are now at what 40 minutes or something, and
Yeah,
if you have a little bit more time and if you think we can have that discussion, I'm more than willing to kind of continue. आपको पता था कि I knew, I told you कि Noam Chomsky was very limited time होगा. I told you that in advance. So he's doing interview after interview after interview. So as much as we can get out of him, and is a treasure trove for us. Jitna bhi hum whatever knowledge we can get from Professor Noam Chomsky. So if there are any koi swal that maybe I can be of some use value to, so I would be more than willing.
Shahzad Bhatti, Professor, what would be your take on South China Sea engagements and emergence of China as player vis-a-vis game of the balance of power? अब ये तो सवाल जाहिर सी बात है डायरेक्टली तो उनसे है, बट इवन अगर आप इस पे कोई कमेंट करना चाहें. यस,
ये तो बल्कि बेहतर ही है कि मुझसे राइट राइट
सवाल हैं जो उनसे ही थे और उनको ही करने चाहिए थे, लेकिन बहरहाल यहाँ पे लोग बहुत खुश हैं और बहुत से लोगों ने वेलकम किया है. फरीहा सरफराज हमारे साथ थी. नेवर न्यू आई वुड यूज नोम चॉम्स्की. इसी तरह गुलफाम, लव एंड रिस्पेक्ट. सो पीपल आर हैप्पी और उनको बहुत अच्छा लगा कि पाकिस्तान के किसी भी चैनल पे इस तरह से वो भी यूट्यूब चैनल पे.
Absolutely. Shaiba, let's, I mean, maybe just a couple of these questions, since we have a little bit of time. Throw both let's try to tackle them, if that's okay with you. Yeah. So for example, and very briefly, the issue of I mean, this is a central issue, and obviously Professor Chomsky के पास time नहीं था इसको address करने के लिए. I mean, a whole lot of new geopolitical arrangements that are occurring and realignments जो हो रहे हैं दुनिया में. But of course, the central big elephant in the room is the rise of China, right? And so in some ways the reorientation of the global order from a Western kind of dominated world order that has not only been, I mean, we're not just we are talking about the past 500 years, from 1492 to the present. So we are seeing a major shift in world order. We are living in very dangerous times as well. It is an age of transition, a very chaotic situation. We don't know in which direction things will go. But the one thing is very clear, and specifically in the Pakistani case, is that this is in some ways the first time that we have the two largest powers in the world, if you want to call them both superpowers. At least the US is a superpower, that China is a potential rising superpower. Two superpowers that are dependent right now on Pakistan, right? The US is dependent on Pakistan to rescue it in Afghanistan on the one hand, and on the second hand, they also don't. The American political establishment does not want Islamabad to become even closer into the camp of Beijing, into the camp of China. So that's why they're very careful now. And if you follow the American media coverage of Pakistan since the past 2 years, it is a remarkable difference. बहुत फर्क है from what you see from
Yeah.
2001 to 2018. You don't even see any, negative coverage of Pakistan anymore. So that's one thing. China, as we all know, is encircled by American naval ships throughout the South China Sea, the Malacca Straits, and of course, American military bases surrounding it. So, that just needs a catalyst for some type of confrontation. And even agar direct ek kisam ka military confrontation nahi ho, the American ships can easily blockade the trade routes in the Malacca Straits and South China Sea. In which case, China is utterly dependent on the port of Gwadar. China is energy hungry. It gets all of its oil reserves, all of these things from primarily the Middle East, and so it is also utterly dependent on Pakistan for the access to this, and the $40 billion investment they've done in Iran as well, again to access these ports. So we have a very interesting situation here. Pakistan's the value of Pakistan's geopolitical role has enormously increased, and what's going to happen in East Asia and the South China Sea? That's John Pilger has this very good documentary I recommend to our viewers on YouTube. It's called The Coming War with China. The interesting thing is, we spoke with Professor Chomsky about the war on terrorism. The very interesting and funny thing is that in the 2020 National Defense Security document of the United States, उसमें terrorism का नाम का लफ्ज़ ही नहीं है अब. ठीक है? So the major threats to the US right now are great power rivalries, and they mention them explicitly, China and Russia. ठीक है? तो अब war on terrorism वो खत्म ही हो गया. अब all of a sudden, now the US ruling elite realizes the real competitors in the world order that they have to deal with. So China is the rising power, and जो drama हम देख रहे हैं Trump के दौरान, sanctions, all of this is all about this. And now we see with the 5G technology, etc. ये सारा कुछ हो रहा है because of the recognition that the only country on this planet right now that can even remotely compete with the United States in high tech and all of these other type of industries that actually produces things. This coronavirus issue has kind of revealed all of the contradictions and the inequalities that exist in the U.S. and the inability of the U.S. government, of the national governments, state governments to actually address the issue, whereas not just China, like in a whole bunch of other East Asian countries have done a far better job in controlling these things. So we are witnessing what we can call a reorientation of the world order, in moving from the west to the east. उसमें तो कोई शक ही नहीं है.
True, that's true. बिल्कुल ये बहुत ही अच्छा आपका एनालिसिस है, और अगर इस पे हम प्रोफेसर चॉम्स्की से बात कर सकते तो उनकी राय भी सामने आती. बहरहाल तो मेरा ख्याल हम इसको अब कंक्लूड करते हैं, वाइंड अप करते हैं. आज का शो तो बाहर के साहब के नाम था, तो हम नहीं चाहते कि हम उनसे ज्यादा बात करें. तो इंशाल्लाह इन टॉपिक्स पे आपके साथ पे किसी नेक्स्ट शो में सिटिंग करेंगे, कोशिश करेंगे कि आपको दोबारा बुलाएं और उनके साथ ये सिलसिला जारी रहे. हमारे दानिश के सुनने वालों के लिए ये नया हमारा वेंचर है दानिश टीवी इंग्लिश, और इस सिलसिले में हम इंशाल्लाह आगे चल के मजीद इंग्लिश के प्रोग्राम्स भी पेश करते रहेंगे. थैंक यू वेरी मच.
इंशाल्लाह. थैंक यू. अल्लाह हाफिज.